So this conversation is a very relaxed, quasi-informal conversation, but nonetheless, I hope it will be informative and, more importantly, insightful into some of the background and personalities, and I'm hoping for a lot of gossip and stories of previous times as well. So we thought it would be really useful tonight to hear from both Julie and Cary to talk about some of the history of both these individuals, but also of this institution, this university, this Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and the degree to which those ideas may have been nascent 30 years ago? Can I say 40 years ago?
40 years ago.
40 years ago. And where they are now. So, you know, in the background, there will be images passing through of times past as little reference points. So I want to begin by first asking Julie to say a few words, and particularly to tell us what it was that brought her to the University of Melbourne, and what was it like to be a student architect in the 70s?
Yeah, I started 72.
That's when I started, but not here.
You weren't, oh good, I thought I'd forgotten you already. Is my mic on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so...
and feel free to have a drink.
Feel free to have a drink. So I came to architecture school because I didn't feel confident enough to go to art school, and I didn't feel that I wanted to write essays on end. And I came into the architecture school, and there was a guy with a club foot called Mr. Caldecott, and he taught structures, and his wife, Beth Caldecott, also taught structures. And I spoke to him, and I said, I'm thinking of doing architecture, what do you think? And he said, it doesn't really matter what you do, it's a great education. And I thought, wow, I never thought of it that way. And that's kind of why I ended up, because it had drawing, it had environmental stuff, it had history, it had such a gamut of knowledge that you were presented with. And then I got in, and then I came, and that's kind of how I started. What did you do, Cary? Did you have any, well, you come from a family of architects, you've got a whole problem.
I came with baggage.
Yeah, you did.
You know, as many would know, my father was an architect. My mother was an interior designer. My two uncles were architects. My grandfather was an architect.
Oh my God.
And I had,
This is
and
not.
I had my two older brothers preceding me in the Bachelor of Architecture course at Melbourne University. So
I don't think this is baggage. I think this is a storage shed.
I was an independent thinker in any case, and I chose to do architecture for my own reasons. But so I started in 1977, finished in 1982. I mean, the thing that I was relating to others today that distinguishes that period, which many of you, if you're students here now, will not think is even able to be contemplated, that from 1974, when Gough Whitlam came in as the Prime Minister of Australia, he implemented free university education. But it only lasted from 1974 till 1984, when John Dawkins was the Education Minister under Bob Hawke, and it was ended and HECS fees came in. So I was 77 to 82, so I was right in pretty much the only sweet spot of getting a completely free...
72 was, oh no, you had to pay union fees.
Yeah. Completely free education. So it's sort of interesting, I mean, we can sort of talk about this, that you know, you were more tolerated as a student rather than, you know, having a whole project called the New Student Precinct, where students are, in a sense, fee paying, and you know, they've got scholarship, but they're also, in a sense, customers of the university. So it was a completely different vibe for the education, and the way the school was run. All the staff were tenured, so many had been here for a long time. I mean, I might be brave enough to say many had been here for perhaps too long.
Julie?
I want to go back to Gough Whitlam, because without Gough Whitlam, I would never have met my architect husband in first year of architecture school, because he eliminated the draft. And I think 3 or 4 of my very good friends, including him, would not have been in architecture school. So that's 72. And those papers came in that the draft would be, I don't remember when the election was that year, but it must have been just before school started, something like that. So, you know, you talk about Grant Morani from the Halftime Club. He was conscripted. Hank was conscripted. So these were, you know, this was lucky days. And there was a rebellious spirit. There was a lot of questioning of authority. And it basically meant that nobody trusted anything that was the institution. I think now we trust our educational institutions more. And notwithstanding that the people I know in education in this school are good and great, I think we trust them too much. I think there's not enough questioning happening. And we were just in an era where your first response was no, not yes, or how do I get there? So I think that critical thinking was really important to me, and that state of mind I never lost. To me, it's more important not to do as you're told, but to work out what it is you think you should do, and if it corresponds, that's good. And if you're going to go back to stories, I'll tell you how Hank and I nearly got expelled from the university. So getting back to the issue of authority, we didn't really think the department was being run all that well. We were 19, I mean, we knew a lot. And we thought that there was no space for students, and we demolished partitions on the 4th floor of the old architecture school to make a student lounge. And we thought this was a pretty good idea, and the offices were vacant anyway. And we got pulled up to whatever the tribunal was called, and they kept asking us, did you know what you were doing? And we said, of course we knew what we were doing. Why do you think we did it? And we finally, because again at 19 you're not as smart as you think you are, we worked out that what they wanted us to say was, no we didn't, because otherwise they would have had to discipline us and throw us out. So we worked out soon enough that that was the answer. But I think that sort of story is the story of that kind of era, of the era of students not really feeling that, it gets back to your point. We weren't customers, we were kind of tolerated in an environment, and that you had to depend a lot on your own ability to pull up opportunities. Now, I think it's a pretty naive idea what I'm projecting, because it wasn't that unstructured, and I sure learned a lot. And we had some incredible faculty back then. I'm rambling, but I'm on jet lag, so you'll have to forgive me. But do you agree? Before I keep talking too much.
No. I mean, as an example of you know, just the sort of free education, you know, we were always in arguments with the faculty of the school at the time about access to studio space. You know, because it wasn't just like you'd have a laptop then and open it up anywhere. You had to have a drawing board and a T-square and all that kind of stuff. But you were not given access to studios on a permanent basis, so you couldn't put down roots. You couldn't, I'm not sure what the arrangement is here if you're doing like your major thesis, whether or not you can occupy the building. So some things don't change. Why aren't they revolting against that, Don?
Yeah.
Well, I think it changed in between. But now I think all of the major schools of architecture in Australia, there's no, or very few, where you have dedicated studio space that you keep for a semester or for a whole year.
Yeah. So I mean, you'll see somewhere up in one of these slides, it looks like a sort of an odd garret with lots of desks and students working. I mean, we chose to rebel by saying we'll go and hire our own studio above a car repair place near the Victoria Market. We quickly painted all the walls to make it decent. It was rat infested, freezing cold in winter, stinking hot in summer, but 12 of us rented it, and we basically ran our major project together through that studio, and we just had an incredible collegiate learning experience doing that work together.
So tell us a little bit, Julie, about the Halftime Club. It's certainly been mentioned, and there's some sort of aspects that go into that. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I went back to the source, so I didn't screw it up. I spoke to Grant Morani, who was in architecture school when we started. We actually had a studio with desks that were assigned, and most of the people in that set of desks stayed friends, oddly enough. But Grant started the Halftime Club. He felt that there was no bridge between school and practice, and we were all just beginning to get into practice. And a number of us worked in the same place, and he gave me the quote of what the Halftime Club said, and it's in my phone somewhere, but I'll pass on that. But he felt that there was a need for sort of critical discussion. And he said it was, as he put it, it was a pretty incredible time because the idea of an Australian culture was emerging with popular culture. So Picnic at Hanging Rock and that whole genre, Peter Weir and all of those people, and then AC/DC and rock bands and the whole rock thing in pubs and all of this. And where was architecture? And Venturi's thinking had entered the system. It's like this was about place and vernacular and all of these things. And so he started to put a group together, and it turned out that the first meeting of the Halftime Club was where Hank and I were living on Cardigan Street, and Steve Ashton was living. So he must have been at that first meeting too, given he was in the house. We were trying to work out who was there. We think there was about 15 people. I think Ian McDougall was there.
Howard Rager.
And Howard was there probably.
Yeah.
So we're all the same set of people with the same set, I don't know. Anyway, the deal was that Transition started, the magazine started around the same time, and that was deliberate, and that one was led by Richard Mundy and Ian McDougall. But anyhow, so back to Halftime. So Halftime started in our living room, and then within a couple of months, it moved to pubs around town. We left within 12 months of it starting and went to study in the States, and it continued. And as Grant put it, the participation was rowdy. So they got kicked out of one pub and had to keep moving to another because they were too aggressive and too noisy. But I think the conversation that came out of it has developed a distinctly Melbourne architecture, and we forget that those roots go back to that. Would you agree that it influenced?
Yeah, came to Halftime Club. I wasn't part of the foundation story.
You were too young.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we're the same generation now, but of course, like when I was in first year, Julie's in final year, and it was like, the final year students doing all this amazing stuff, and you were like the kid at the front of the class, listening with all ears to what happened. But my first Halftime Club was not until 1981, so 2 years later when Glenn Murcutt was invited to come and talk to the Halftime Club. I mean, at that time, 1981, Glenn had been published in Transition magazine, which was like, ooh, published in Transition magazine. And he'd just done the Murray Short farmhouse, which is probably his most early celebrated work he did for a client, and then eventually bought it for himself, and now I think still lives there. So he came down to a pub, spoke at a pub in Smith Street. I can't remember the name of the pub, and there were probably 40 or 50 people there, but like it was a pretty intense evening. And what I'm going to just add to sort of Julie's comments, what some of you younger architects here don't realise, that the idea of practice, but theory and practice, was quite antithetical to like what was happening, say, in this school at the time. There was no courses, there was no discussion about the idea of architectural theory. You had history classes, which was the dutiful step-by-step, Western civilization history of architecture. The Empire style moves to this style and that moves to this style. But the idea of talking about architecture in theoretical terms was almost like a sin, within the sort of professional niceties of what architecture is supposed to be in professional terms. So I think in part Halftime was to take on board the idea of theory, which was out and about in most other discussions and publications about architecture. You mentioned Robert Venturi, who sadly, as you would know, died a couple of weeks ago at the age of 93. So that idea of being able to speak to architecture as a constructed knowledge, theory, was really one of the other foundations of the Halftime Club. You had to stand up in front of your work and talk about it. So Glenn came down in a pub full of young, raucous Melbourne architects and talked about his work. And I must say, my memory is he talked about it extraordinarily eloquently, and he got a lot of respect for that. You know, he was bold enough to say that he was seeking out an Australian architecture and laid out in his terms what he thought that meant and what he was doing with that in architectural terms. And, you know, he got some pretty intense questioning, but I think it's all...
As you do at the halftime.
I mean, you were talking about with the Halftime Club and transitions, that there was also a kind of, I wouldn't say a search, but there was a kind of discourse going on about Australian architecture, what might define it and stuff.
Yep.
And then you went off to America.
Yeah.
Your brother went to Pennsylvania and spent time and worked for Venturi.
Yep.
What was the sort of push-pull going on, I think, particularly between America and Australia at that time, but also, you know, where did Melbourne or Australia architecture in general feel that it fit within the larger context of world architecture? I mean, was it always, well, I'll let you answer how it...
Well, I mean, I feel like at that time it was, you know, a very conscious reaction to the idea of, you know, call it a generic international modernism being taught in this school and other schools and being probably pervasive within the profession. And therefore there was, you know, a desire to try and find some other way of thinking about architecture, and then that led to these, you know, various diffused different conversations around the town.
So we came back 83 or 84 and talked to the Halftime Club. So this is kind of an interesting record. And I don't think the self-confidence of Australian practice then was not the self-confidence of Australian practice now. So be careful that you don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But they gave us a grilling. We came and we talked about stuff we'd been doing in the States, and it was design algorithms. And there wasn't any really nifty software at that time. We were actually doing algorithms and outcomes manually because the software wasn't sophisticated enough to handle it. And basically you'd sold out because it was machine-led. So the discussions about science downstairs, about CRISPR gene things, that came back to me, and it's like, well, maybe it's not so bad if I work at what it can do. It's about how we use it, not what it is. But anyhow, so that was the beginning. And then it was that you went to the States, you sold out. And that argument, after a couple of drinks, got louder and really irritating. And I was kind of pleased to go back because I was free. Now, the issue of going to another country by choice, not because you have to, is you are outside of the system that you're used to judging you. And you can do whatever you like. And no one's going to say anything, including your parents. You know, it's liberating. And I've always liked the idea of being an outsider. I didn't really want to belong to the club. And so I find this idea of an Australian architecture, especially in the context of what's going on in the world in terms of immigration and stuff, really confusing. And I'm uncomfortable with it. But then again, when you see the results of the architecture, it's incredibly liberating. So I don't know how to solve this issue. Do you have any insight? Help me.
Yeah, but I think at the time, you know, to return to your question, like at the time, and say the late 70s, early 80s, it was a completely legitimate conversation to have because of this, you know, the sort of generic model of still holding sway over the profession is to say, well, we don't want to speak in a generic international language. We want to speak in a distinctive local language, and that was, of course, the rhetoric of Peter Corrigan and his work, and in a different way, Glenn Murcutt, to be honest. So it was, a very self-assertion of a national identity in a positive way, and like there were some fantastic things that came out of it. In fact, I remember coming to a Halftime Club when Halftime Club got properly organised a little bit later, and people used to put in money and seek sponsorship and have formal meetings, which for a whole day, and the club booked out the Seiselcraft Theatre, which is the predecessor of this theatre in the old building, and ran a day session on what is Australian architecture, and invited Philip Cox down from Sydney. He'd at that time was probably best known for a couple of books he wrote, with Wesley Fox about old colonial towns in Australia, and he'd sort of written a lot about Australian architecture. And Shane Murray, who's now Dean of Architecture and Design at Monash University, spoke, and Richard Munday, who was one of the founding editors of Transition, spoke, and Ivor Indyk, who subsequently went to New York and had a great sort of cultural studies history as well. But it was like a day of debating it. What is it? Why is it important? So I think it was interesting at the time to do that, and maybe that lasted for a few years, and then the debate moved on, and now you can look back on it. It's all sort of a bit nationalistic and a bit strange, but it seemed like a very worthy
It was an important
debate at the
transition.
time.
But
And now you don't really. I mean, now what's interesting is, like, since that time you've had the complete swing to globalisation, and now there's almost like the swing back to
Closed borders.
to the local. Like, what's interesting about Julie's practice is like how oddly local it is to Los Angeles in so many ways, and you can look at even a influential architect like Robert Venturi and say, in his bones, he's a Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or you can look at Rem Koolhaas and say, in his bones, he's Dutch. Or you can look at Frank Gehry and say, no matter what he does around the world, he's also carries Los Angeles in him everywhere. And that's, so, I think we're almost like back to a cycle where we could be brave enough to say, what is an Australian, not what is an Australian architecture, like what is a Melbourne architecture?
You're both graduates from here.
Mm-hmm.
You're both alumni from the University of Melbourne. You both spent considerable time, some longer than others. As a kind of thinking forward, what do you think is important to establish University of Melbourne beyond what it's already known for?
I feel that we're taking away risk. And I think it's something that kids have worked so hard to get here that they don't want to risk anything to lose the leg up that's given them. And I think risk is really important. And I think that means risk in the way you use a building as much as I think it means risk in the way you approach an academic future. I'm interested in seeing how universities are taking on more ideas about research of ideas that corporations in the past have had responsibility for, and I think that's really interesting. But I don't know what it means to do that, but I just feel that it's too safe. I don't mean it should be physically, that you should, get yourself killed or whatever. But I think risk needs to be encouraged.
I mean, I'd probably take a more directly discipline-specific approach to answering that question. I was very interested to read, your recently retired Vice-Chancellor's recent book, which was called The Idea of an Australian University, or some similar turn of phrase, I can't remember. And he, I thought it was a very interesting book for those that have been around the sector for a while. But what he characterised Australian universities as being is traditionally metropolitan universities. So University of Melbourne would service the needs of, it's the top university in Melbourne, even local students would come for that reason. And then the transformation to a top 50 global university, and now with more than 50% of the income into the university coming from international students, you get this very interesting tension in a positive sense between the global university and the local university. And I think the interesting question for a university such as Melbourne is to say, how does that play out in architectural and urban design terms to bring it back to our discipline? So on the one hand, you could say, the university could be commissioning the best international architects around the world to come and do buildings on the campus, or the university could be fostering local talent that has been trained in the halls of this building and take a very local approach. I mean, the truth, of course, can lie somewhere in between, but I would certainly be saying that, in the long term, to try and make a very specific local experience for students, because that's what students are looking out for, and that's certainly what we hope we can achieve in the student precinct. What's interesting to us is having been as you said, we've been designing campus buildings for a long time, and 15 years ago, as online learning took off and MOOCs, so-called MOOCs, happened, then everyone was putting a question mark against what is the role of a university campus. Everyone can just access content in a virtual way, so the geography of a campus is not that critical. But in fact, what has happened in the last 10 years is the opposite's true, that the availability of content online has sort of almost pushed content not into the background. Of course, scholarship is always going to be the primary thing in a university, but the flip side is that it's actually made place much more important on a campus. So a student chooses to go to this university because of the place, the experience of the place, or chooses to go to RMIT, as a sort of more inner metropolitan campus, or chooses to go to wherever in Australia or indeed internationally. And to me and to the practice, that's fantastic for architects, because that's a great conversation to be a part of, and it's absolutely true. That's why students are selecting to come. I mean, obviously this is a great university in every metric, but it's a pretty fantastic campus and a pretty fantastic location to want to come and spend some time in.
So thank you to Professor Carey Lyon, to Dr. Julie Eizenberg, and thank you all very much for coming this evening and for participating in the end of today's New Student Precinct Festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you.